I grew up in public housing. I grew up in a project. Um, I grew up in a place called Marble Hill Projects. I grew up in the 50s and the 60s there. And I remember people left their doors open. I remember when I used to trick or treat, I'd come home with bags and bags and bags of candy. I remember the integrated environment where it was almost like the United Nations where I grew up. Every type of person was there represented. Kids used to swim in the river. This is a housing project in the 50s and 60s. The New York City Housing Authority called it the Country Club. I mean, where out of the scores of projects in New York City, when they said the Country Club, they meant where I lived. I'm just curious. Those of you who lived in housing projects in the 50s and the 60s, was it like that for you? Housing projects, when they were first designed, were like something to be proud of once you got into it. America has always had a problem with housing. We've never had enough housing. Today, we're 5 million houses short. Roughly 20 million people need housing in this country. And housing is not ever keeping up to the rate. Looking today with rising interest rates and rising mortgage rates and rising rents, there's going to be less and less housing for people. 1.2 million people live in public housing. Now, I'm going to go through briefly a history of public housing. I'm going to talk about the projects. I'm going to talk about the Section 8 program. I'm going to talk about Title 6 and all those type of things. I think it's important. But please let me know if your experience in growing up in the 50s and the 60s in housing was like mine. The first housing project developed was authorized by Herbert Hoover and was implemented in Atlanta, Georgia. It was called Techwood Housing. Franklin Delano Roosevelt came down to give a speech when they opened it in 1935. It was white only. But what it replaced was a place called Techwood Flats. Techwood Flats was 28% black. Techwood Flats was such an eyesore that in the 1920s there were still people in Atlanta, Georgia proper using outhouses and there was no running water. So, they replaced Techwood Flats, with Techwood Housing, a massive housing project that eventually wound up being part of it being used for the Atlanta Olympics. In 1937, there was the Wagner-Spiegel Act, which opened $500 million for public housing. But again, the redlining, the Public Works Authority, they tended to build projects or housing on places that were either industrial sites or some type of location that people were not interested in living in. During World War II, there was a tremendous housing boom. And there wasn't much money put into building housing because that money went into the war effort. Once when the war ended in 1949, President Truman implemented the slum clearance program, which decimated areas. Shortly afterwards, the GI Bill was announced, and private homes were being built. And along the same times in the late 40s, early 50s, was one of the major construction points of housing, vertical high-rise housing. But they tended to build these places where there weren't many jobs or transportation. In St. Louis, there was a place called Pewitt-Igoe. This was 33 buildings. It was designed by the man who designed the World Trade Center. Pewitt-Igoe was, I believe, was a segregated development. By the late 60s, there was the beginning of white flight, and Pewitt-Igoe became all black. This is one thing that governments miss, is they can put in this great infrastructure, they can put in 33 buildings. Once they leave, once the federal government's done its work, now it's up to the public municipality to maintain that. To maintain 33 11-story buildings. The money just disappeared. That's how most of the housing developments fell apart. There just wasn't the ongoing money. But I consider the most famous of all the housing developments was Cabrini Green. If you've ever seen the series Good Times, that was filmed at Cabrini Greens. That in itself, I would say, would be the poster child of housing projects. In 1965, Lyndon Baines Johnson created the Housing and Urban Development Organization, which went on a massive level of building housing. By 1974, there was a moratorium on housing. They had seen what happened with Pewitt-Igoe, which I didn't tell you, which was torn down in 20 years. They announced the Section 8 program, figuring if they give people vouchers, people could go out and find their own houses. In 1999, they scrapped all ideas of building vertical skyscrapers, and then the idea came scattered site housing, mixing the housing into the existing community. Hope 6 came in 1996. In 1998, I'm sorry. That was a great opportunity, a new incentive into building low-rise buildings for people to live in. Affordable housing has been an incredible problem throughout American history. America has never, ever had the opportunity to have enough housing to support all its people. Again, the problem is once you put up these developments and people start to leave, your tax base goes and you can't afford the maintenance. I'd like to thank you for your time. I'd like to have you give me a thumbs up if you can, and have a great day.